trying to make a permanent, lingering effect for your game can be quite appealing. There's a lot of different thematic flavors that you might be trying to hit there, but it is always going to be a challenge to balance. And for the love of God, don't make it an ability that persists based on the thing staying in the bin. Hi, I'm Michael from Michael the Gathering. This is Card of the Day. Today we're talking about anger, and by extension, the rest of the Jedi cycle. Some of the most horrifically unbalanced cards from a meaningful downtime perspective, printed other than, I guess, the Eminence cards. And just like the Eminence cards, Commander players love these things. So yeah, the Judgment incarnations, the first use of the incarnation type line, which would later become incredibly cursed, were called Jedi during design because the idea was that they were a creature where if you struck them down, they would become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. This is a real thing, you can look it up. And honestly, the thing that I respect most about anger and the rest of the cards printed in Judgment is the fact that they really set a precedent for incarnation telling us that something horribly wrong was going on here. Like, we'll just isolate anger here. You have a creature that wants to just give you haste once it's been killed for the rest of the game. And I get that we didn't have emblems back in the day. Anger could just simply, on death, leave you with an emblem that says creatures you control have haste. And I would still have plenty of problems with it because that's just so good, but also deeply, deeply uninteractive. I think it's entirely possible that at the time of Judgment's design, WotC could have easily come up with, say, the Duskmourn Enduring Enchantment Cycle style effect, at least that early. Something dies and then comes back and it's not a creature anymore. Sure, it's a bit of a weird and complicated ruling thing, but it's not like Lycids didn't already exist, and these stupid things don't even turn into enchantments, they turn into auras, which is so much worse. If you're not familiar with incarnations, I'm going to run down them right now, because yes, this video isn't anybody's request, it's purely me indulging myself in some absolute design nerdery here. We had anger and the rest of its cycle of if you have this basic and this thing is in your graveyard, then you get to have some sort of creature base effect, which were First Strike, Flying, Trample, and Swamp Walk, which just... So obviously, Flying and Haste are the best ones here. Haste in particular being just so much better than the rest of the pack. And then randomly you had a couple of rare ones that you could activate from the graveyard for additional stuff, which I get is more complicated, but is just not as powerful as a constant free Anthem effect. Rarity design back in the day made no sense. Then, however many years later, in Lorwyn, we got a new incarnation cycle, this time all rares, with a graveyard effect that is that if they would go to the graveyard from anywhere, you shuffle it back into the library, which I've always thought was a really weird second move to go from incarnations or a graveyard-based type to our next set of incarnations with the same sort of naming scheme. So this is very clearly meant to be a straight line drawn between the two things, just avoids the graveyard entirely. Then we get the Modern Horizons incarnations, and it's kind of crazy to look at these and realize that while this is what incarnations are known for now, the absolutely enormous ETB effects, as evidenced, the entire first half of Incarnation history had nothing to do with it. Now, in terms of relation to the original Incarnations, I actually give these ones a relatively high grade because a huge part of the point of an evoke creature is to play it and then have its body sitting in the graveyard for you to do reanimation shenanigans with it, as I'm sure everybody who has had a grief cast on them and had it immediately not be dead after all is intimately familiar with. And of course, in our return to Lorwyn, we got 2 new sets of incarnations. These ones, again, elemental incarnations, which is clearly meant to be a very specific reference to the Modern Horizons ones. Again, slightly weird because those weren't actually the original set of incarnations, but now we're just leaning into the incredibly cursed nature of them. We got encore ones which come out of the graveyard, and we got evoke ones which put themselves into the graveyard for absolutely horrific things to happen to them. Shout out and absolutely no apology to all of my victims of a turn 4 deceit by way of Kavero. The other lineage that Anger shares is, I would say, Bridge from Below, which is another deeply comical attempt to fundamentally change the way that Magic is played, which was broken over the collective needs of the player base. Bridge from Below seems to be a relatively straightforward card, except that it says, if Bridge from Below is in your graveyard, meaning that you're fundamentally not supposed to cast this, or somehow in mono black you're supposed to put this enchantment onto the battlefield and then sacrifice it? I don't know. Bridge from Below doesn't have a way for you to get it into the graveyard easily. It's just fundamentally meant to be an incredibly weird time spiral block card that wasn't a thing that was widely playtested. That's kind of the idea of Time Spiral Block. It was just do crazy things like print harmonize or like and subscribe to this channel. So the decks that use Bridge from Below are things like Landless Dredge, where dumping your entire deck into the graveyard is part of the point, and then suddenly you have a manaless source of 2/2 creatures whenever your non-token creatures die, and all you have to do is loop them in some sort of way, like with Bloodghasts or whatever you want to do. Even just these 2 examples of Anger and Bridge from Below should make it relatively clear that changing the fundamental way that a game is played is not something that a designer should be doing at the card level. Formats exist. And I can tell you right now that when I was concepting this video, I did not anticipate to start talking about Anger and end up talking about Dan. Because, yeah, Dan, Judge Tower, these are really, really good ways to play with your Magic cards that are not normal Magic. They fundamentally change the way that Magic is played in a novel and interesting way that changes the context of what cards are good. Some cards are just actively terrible for a format like Judge's Tower or Dan, and even more conventional but still kind of weird formats like Two-Headed Giant or Emperor. Magic is fundamentally, from the ground up, designed for 1v1 and Commander nowadays, but players are always going to be building new formats. A specific card really shouldn't be trying to go out of its way to turn, say, normal standard play into an alternate format, because, and this is true of basically all card games ever, that's either going to be totally, utterly unplayable, or it's going to be absolutely broken. And also part of the problem with that is that you're forcing your opponents to play a sufficiently different card game that you're going to do damage to the playability of your game, the replayability, the appeal of your game. Professionals do know this, and the people that I'm really talking to are those casual designers submitting cards to custom contents that are just massively over-designed. I must speak to you, casual designers. There is so much room for creativity, even within the bounds of what you would call totally normal Magic cards. It's a case of there are infinitely many decimals between 0 and 1. Take the incredibly complicated card that you're trying to fit an entirely different way of playing the game onto a rectangle and just make your own format. Playtest it with your friends. I recognize that this might be more playtesting for your ideas than you have ever done before in your lives, But I beg you, anger is good because you can skip the intended sequence and just stick it into your graveyard without ever casting the spell, and you don't need it to be a basic mountain to switch it on. Bridge from Below is either a complete brick or an instantly bannable card. Epic spells, Form of the Something enchantments, arguably Infect and Mill. All of these are things that are generally either too weak or they become strong because they fundamentally skip over some part of what is meant to be the interesting and interactive part of Magic gameplay. Hopefully WotC learns these things and they don't do something stupid like trying to fix Epic.